Red-haired Shanks and Blackbeard. Just their names alone carry as much weight as any other in the Great Pirate Era. But while their resumes are quite similar, their fates could not be more diametrically opposed. Both were apprentices on legendary pirate crews, but Shanks was with Roger and Teach was with Whitebeard. Both seem to share mysterious connections with the opposing sides of God Valley, Shanks with Fagarlin Garling and Teach with Rox D. Zebek. And both have motivated our protagonist in a major way. Shanks inspired Luffy to become the pirate that he is today, while Blackbeard currently stands as Luffy's greatest rival as a pirate. Their fates have been intertwined since a very young age, and that rivalry has only continued to grow as time has gone on. Shanks' famous scar comes from none other than Blackbeard, who Shanks went out of his way to warn Whitebeard about in the first place. And at Marineford, Blackbeard said that it was too early for them to fight, which hints that the time will come eventually. And I think their battle might happen sooner than we think. I mean, we know that Shanks has been pursuing Blackbeard because that's why he went to Wano in the first place, and the last we saw each of them, they were on adjacent islands taking down Kid and Law, and Shanks even said that he was heading out shortly after. But on top of all that, we even got this recent message from Oda at Jump Festa, where he said, "At last, it'll happen." The battle between that character and that character may lead to unexpected results, and I suppose it's still anyone's guess at this point, but the phrasing here makes it seem like this fight has to be one that's been set up for a while. So the two matchups that jump out to me right away are either Shanks vs Blackbeard or even Zoro vs Mihawk. I mean, Oda's been moving all four of these chess pieces around since Wano ended because they're all major parts of Emperor crews. And these are two 1v1s that we know are basically inevitable. And honestly, we're pretty deep in the final saga already, so I think there's even a world where we get both of these fights very close to one another, if not even at the same time. Because Shanks and Mihawk also share a lot of deep connections. They had their own legendary duels back in the day, so for them to both fight their other rivals at the same time, and maybe even lose, could be about as beautiful of an ending as you could hope for. Which I know that Shanks losing to Blackbeard sounds blasphemous to some, so I actually did a poll recently because I was kind of curious where you guys stood on the matter, and it seems like you all gave a slight edge to Blackbeard, which is good because I absolutely agree. But before we dive into the actual fight, let me first kind of talk about why this matchup is so compelling in the broader context of the story, because it really all starts with Luffy. Shanks is his inspiration, and Blackbeard is his nemesis. Shanks tried to save his brother Ace, while Blackbeard is at least partially responsible for his death. Shanks is the reason Luffy has his devil fruit, while Blackbeard is the one guy who can take those powers away without even needing to kill him. Oda has made Shanks and Blackbeard into kind of Luffy's sun and moon in a way, and I think that might be because Shanks and Blackbeard also represent the two kinds of pirates, Peace Mains and Morganeers. These were first established in Oda's one-shot called Romance Dawn that preceded the actual story of One Piece, where Luffy explained what each type was like. Peace Mains are pirates who just want to be free and adventure, like Luffy, Roger, or Shanks. Morganeers, on the other hand, mainly become pirates to pillage and take from others. A lot of villains in the stories are probably examples of this, especially including Marshall D. Teach, and that's what really makes the Jaya arc so special. Blackbeard's introduction showed us right away that he and Luffy were two sides of the same coin, because both of them had opposite reactions to the cherry pie and the apple juice. But I think Oda's genius really shines in the scene following this, because Bellamy bursts in and gives the Straw Hats trouble, thus giving us a clear parallel to Shanks in Chapter 1, where Luffy and Zoro decide to behave the same way as Shanks did and not fight back. By showing us these scenes one after the other, it not only shows us that Luffy and Blackbeard are two sides of the same coin, but it then reminds us that Luffy and Shanks are on the same side of the coin. A big reason why Luffy is on that side of the coin and why he acted that way in the bar that day is because of Shanks. And by introducing Blackbeard in literally the same chapter and in the same bar that Luffy acted like Shanks in, it not only foreshadows Luffy's rivalry with Blackbeard, but even Shanks's, because we didn't even know they had a connection until after this. And I think it might even be more genius that Oda used the idea of avoiding unnecessary conflict as the central point for this parallel, because Shanks and Blackbeard both do that, but in very opposing ways. Shanks, and by extension Luffy, don't fight weak people that don't pose a serious threat, like Higumi the Bandit or Bellamy. But on the other hand, we've come to learn that Blackbeard doesn't fight strong people who do pose a serious threat, at least until he knows he can win, like Shanks at Marineford or Akainu in the time skip, for example. One of these actions is born out of courage and one out of cowardice. Oda has built layer upon layer of inversions between these two characters, but there is one thing that unites all of them, and that is the concept of dreams. And that is exactly why, following that scene in Jaya, we get this iconic speech from Blackbeard about how a man's dream never ends. If there's one thing that all great pirates have in common, it's their appreciation for dreams, because it's the one thing that took them each out to sea in the first place. No matter how different those dreams are or how differently they go about achieving them, they're all out there in pursuit of doing so. And to me, that's the true genius of the Jaya arc. And on top of all that, there's one other inversion between Shanks and Blackbeard that I think could honestly be the most genius of all, and that's making them represent the two sides of the One Piece power system, devil fruits and Haki. Kaido mentioned in Wano how a devil fruit power wasn't enough to rule the seas, and just look at Roger, he had no fruit and still brought the world to heel. Such hurdles can only be overcome with Haki. And while I think realistically the answer is somewhere in the middle, I mean Luffy won that fight after all, and he's using a combo of devil fruit and Haki, so there you go. But Shanks and Blackbeard will just be the ultimate showcase of this debate, because Blackbeard is quite literally Oda's devil fruit guy. In a world with all these fantastical powers, it made sense that someone would try harnessing those powers to the fullest by seeking out specific ones and maybe even killing people to get them. And Blackbeard even went as far to kind of break the system by having two devil fruits at once, a development which even surprised the Gorosei. Now, I think this is probably tied to his weird body somehow, but regardless, there's no character that exemplifies the devil fruit side of the One Piece power system like Teach. But on the flip side, we have Shanks, who's probably had a million chances to eat a devil fruit in his life by now, but has decided not to. And not a single member of his crew is believed to have a devil fruit either. But despite that, they're the longest tenured Yonko crew as of right now, and if Vegas existed in One Piece, I have a pretty strong feeling they'd be the odds-on favorite to claim the treasure. Shanks is clearly taking after his old captain Roger, who also succeeded in doing so without a devil fruit. And we know now that Shanks even uses the same attack names as Roger. So there are probably few people who exemplify the Haki side of the One Piece power system like Shanks. But that's why his scar is such a big deal. He got that scar even before Blackbeard had either of his fruits that we're aware of right now. And Shanks even went out of his way to add that he was taking Blackbeard seriously, which is really important because Blackbeard's known for his underhandedness. Oda is using Shanks as a means to communicate how seriously we need to take Blackbeard, because even up until this current point in the story, Shanks has been kind of painted as a type of perfect person in a way. I mean, he was on the past Pirate King's crew, he sacrificed his arm to save our protagonist, he stopped the Marineford War, he took out Kid in one shot to protect Elbaf, etc. So by proxy to Shanks, Blackbeard seems pretty ominous, because even without devil fruits, he was able to throw hands with him somehow. And just with the way the scar looks, it appears that Blackbeard used claws of some sort, and personally, I just cannot see the answer being as simple as these Wolverine claws that we've seen Blackbeard wear. Not only would that be incredibly obvious and anticlimactic, but like, is Oda really expecting us to believe that those things are the difference maker here? But instead, I think those claws are just a foreshadow for something much greater, something that probably only Shanks knows about right now. And that's actually a topic I'm going to dive into in a separate video, so subscribe if you haven't already. But the most relevant part I can share for now is that it has to be tied to why Blackbeard doesn't sleep. Not only is that factor kind of a Chekhov's gun at this point, but Shanks was there when Buggy first revealed that fact to us in the first place. Shanks actually went as far to say that Blackbeard was lucky because he'd get to enjoy life twice as much. So I can definitely see a scenario where Blackbeard falling asleep is actually what ended up letting him scar Shanks originally, thus turning Shanks' jovial attitude about the subject into a very negative one today. Even if we consider how their fight could go down Battleground right now, I find it incredibly interesting how, on the surface, Blackbeard should still be at a big disadvantage, because his main trump card, being the Black Vortex, is useless against Shanks. It's mainly used to catch Devil Fruit users off guard by canceling their powers and sucking them in, but since Shanks has no Devil Fruit, that same advantage doesn't exist. However, since we know Blackbeard scarred Shanks before having any fruits, this fight is definitely far from a done deal still. But before I get into the actual conclusion of the fight, I do think it would be smart to discuss the kind of when, where, and why of it all. And first off, I think their battle is definitely going to start during the Elbaf arc, but not on the actual island of Elbaf. This will be kind of a continuation of something Oda's been doing a lot during Egghead, where we bounced around from place to place, like Winter Island, Elbaf, Hachinosu, the Reverie, etc., even though it's technically all wrapped within the Egghead arc itself. But the reason I don't think this fight will happen on Elbaf specifically is simply because Shanks said he was going for the One Piece. At Elbaf, he said that they got held up and basically that they already should have left the island even before Kid got there. So I don't expect us to see Shanks there when the Straw Hats arrive either. But remember, back in Marineford, Blackbeard told Shanks that it wasn't time for them to fight yet. And if Shanks going for the greatest treasure that there is isn't the right time, then I don't know when is. So I think, like a lot of Blackbeard's strategies, he's trying to swoop in at the very last second to get what he wants. And this is where we can dive into all the fun parallels to that legendary duel between Roger and Whitebeard, because both Shanks and Blackbeard represent each side of that battle. Shanks and Teach were apprentices on both of those crews. Shanks uses Divine Departure like Roger did, while Blackbeard uses the Gura Gura like Whitebeard did. And as far as we're aware, this is also the very first place that Shanks and Teach ever fought. So I suspect that this will also be the island that they have their final battle on as well. I mean, just imagine Shanks and Blackbeard recreating that iconic clash between Roger and Whitebeard from all those years ago. This island is also where Shanks and Buggy mention the fact that Teach didn't sleep. So if that is actually tied to Blackbeard's true power in some way and how he scarred Shanks, it would make a lot of sense for us to learn about that on the same island the idea was introduced on. And remember, Roger vs. Whitebeard was like a big crew vs. crew free-for-all. Yes, the captains fought 1v1, but everyone else was kind of in a big skirmish. So fighting on this island could also give us a lot of awesome panels with maybe Augur against Yasopp, or maybe Shiryu vs. Beckman, maybe Burgess against Rue, etc. And like I said earlier in the video, this would kind of be Oda's showcase of Devil Fruits vs. Haki in a way. So I'd bet we'd get to see a lot of the Blackbeard crew awaken, and also a lot of Shanks' crew do a lot of insane things with Haki that maybe we haven't seen before. I think there's even a good chance that some of their Haki is going to be so strong that it almost mimics Devil Fruit powers in a way, which is something that we've seen before. I think the best example was back in Dressrosa, where Usopp's observation Haki let him see so far that it worked kind of like Viola's powers, who was standing right next to him at the time as well. I also mentioned in my Usopp vs. Augur video how Yasopp is known as Chaser, which could maybe imply that he can have his shots chase after people, sort of like Vanderdecken's Devil Fruit. Shanks also has a flaming sword that we still don't really fully understand. And then this last example isn't exactly Haki, but maybe it's in the same ballpark, where I spoke in my Lucky Roo video about how he might be a master of Life Return, or even Qigong, which we've seen people like Lao Ji or Aunt De Bonham use to transform their body substantially, maybe somewhat mimicking what a Zone Fruit would do. So I think that Shanks vs. Blackbeard will be Oda's chance to kind of show us what's really stronger, Devil Fruits or Haki. And regardless of who wins, I think the answer will still be somewhere in the middle really, but this fight could at least show us that the two sides of the One Piece power system might be a little more similar than we thought. Also, Roger and Whitebeard's fight lasted 3 days and 3 nights, and I bet Shanks and Blackbeard will fight for at least that long. Roger and Whitebeard weren't even trying to kill each other. They likely called it quits just so they could drink and party rather than someone losing. Akainu and Aokiji fought for 10 whole days, and Aokiji is a subordinate to Teach right now. So I'm thinking Shanks vs. Blackbeard might literally last like 2 whole weeks. I know that sounds crazy, but if we assume that the Elbaf arc will take a while and that the Straw Hats will be on the actual island for a while. It could just be that Oda makes their fight last just long enough so that we can wrap up the arc and then maybe Luffy can arrive right when the fight ends. I mean, whoever wins that fight is gonna have an inside track on the One Piece, so making the fight take long enough so that Luffy can do whatever he's got to do in Elbaf and then get there so that everyone's kind of at the same point would also make a lot of sense just logistically for the story. And that kind of ties to one last parallel with Roger vs. Whitebeard, which is that after that fight was done, Whitebeard gave up his poneglyph reader, who was Odin. That moment is really what enabled Roger to go on to become the Pirate King. Now, we aren't familiar with anyone who can read the poneglyphs from either Shanks or Blackbeard right now, but I think Oda could easily just fill that parallel instead with the road poneglyph rubbings. We know that Shanks has some from Kid already, and Blackbeard should have 3 from Law, although we never actually saw him get them, to be fair. This kind of only leaves the one from the man marked by flames in question, but since Shanks said, "Let's go claim the One Piece," it makes it seem like he has that copy already, like he already can go there if he wants to. Now, I'm not saying that Shanks is the man marked by flames or that he knows him or anything like that, because Shanks was there the last time we saw that poneglyph down in Fishman Island, so I think he could have gotten his own copy maybe long before it was ever moved, honestly, or maybe from another Roger pirate, or whatever the case is. It just seems like Shanks can get there if he wants to. And since Shanks is going after it, that's probably what necessitates Blackbeard to fight and stop him, because if Blackbeard were to win, then he would have the inside track to actually go claim the One Piece. So now let's talk about the actual conclusion of the fight, because like I mentioned towards the beginning, I do agree with most of you from this poll that Blackbeard is going to end up winning this battle. Power scaling arguments aside, the narrative of the story really doesn't even allow for Blackbeard to get taken out at this point, and a lot of you were quick to also comment that on the poll that I mentioned, because we all know Luffy is the one who will eventually take out Blackbeard. Also, if Blackbeard were to die here, then what was the entire point of his character? Shanks helped Luffy start his adventure, and Blackbeard is probably going to be there till the very end of it. I think this was already clear for a lot of reasons, but I think that only became more obvious after the reveal that Luffy had the powers of the Sun God, because Blackbeard, conversely, pursued the Darkness Fruit from a very young age. It's quite literally a night and day difference between the two. So I don't see any world where Oda robs us of that climactic Luffy vs. Blackbeard showdown eventually, which by default pretty much has to mean Shanks is gonna lose. Plus, like I said, Blackbeard already scarred him before he had any fruits, at least that we know of, so surely after getting 2 of them, he's gonna have a good chance at winning the next time. However, if we assume that this fight happens before Shanks and Luffy meet again, then we are kind of presented with an issue. Will Luffy get the chance to return the Straw Hat? Well, I think this topic is what makes Shanks dying here so compelling. Blackbeard has already kind of inadvertently taken down several of Luffy's closest friends or family because they stood in his way, and it wasn't really a personal thing to Luffy either. It's almost like fate aligned in such a way to turn Luffy and Blackbeard into mortal enemies by putting Luffy's friends in Blackbeard's way over and over. Ace is the most obvious example since he was hunting down Teach because of Thatch, but we also have Boa, who Blackbeard only went after because of her devil fruit powers, Kobe, who got kidnapped from that same altercation, and now he has Garp as well, who only showed up to Hachinosu because of Kobe. In none of these instances did Teach mess with that person because of their connection to Luffy. In most cases, he had no idea there was a connection at all. He was surprised to hear that Luffy was his brother, and I doubt he's very familiar with Boa or Kobe's obsession with Luffy either. I mean, Boa did have a giant image of Luffy up there, but I digress. And now I think Shanks is simply the next in line for Blackbeard, because similar to all those others I just listed, Teach's issues with Shanks exist entirely outside of the sphere of Luffy. Whether Luffy existed or not, this Shanks vs. Blackbeard fight would probably happen, but because Luffy does exist, it builds their grudge against each other even more, especially if Luffy doesn't get to meet Shanks before their reunion. And while that might be hard to believe that Oda could rob us of that reunion, I think that's exactly what would make that moment hit so hard. Luffy seeing Shanks die or simply hearing the news would probably put him in a similar state to how he was when Ace died. And I think part of that is that yes, someone close to him died, but it's also someone he probably never thought would die because they were so strong. Luffy could never beat Ace in a fight growing up, up, and Shanks is kind of on a whole different level above that. For a lot of reasons, it would really shock Luffy if Shanks were to die. If Shanks were to ever die, Luffy might have to see it to believe it, which is why he might actually have to see it. Because I think a really strong possibility with this fight is that Luffy will arrive to that island right as it's ending, so he can kind of get a final goodbye. Maybe it could kind of play out a little like Film Red with Shanks and Uta. Luffy can pull up right as Teach is landing the finishing blow, and since the fight would probably be taking days or weeks even, Blackbeard would probably be too exhausted to fight Luffy at that point, which would then cause him to scram and then give Shanks and Luffy a chance to talk before he dies right in front of him. This scenario kinda gives the best of both worlds and is probably the most likely in my opinion. Also, Shanks dying in this fashion would provide a pretty good excuse for Luffy to then keep the Straw Hat, because while he's supposed to give it back to Shanks, he's known as Straw Hat Luffy, so having a natural way for him to keep the hat like this would also make sense too. But if Shanks and Blackbeard are going to fight each other, thus reducing the number of Yonko down by 1, then it might make sense for the other Yonko crews to fight each other as well, being the Straw Hats and Cross Guild. This would take our final 4 Yonko down to a championship game essentially, and I'm of the mind that that battle would be a Davy back fight. I know a lot of people think Shanks and Blackbeard could be a Davy back fight, or maybe even Shanks and Luffy potentially, but personally, I think we're gonna get one more major Davy back fight in the story, and I think the Cross Guild is kind of just the perfect opponent for the Straw Hats. We've already defeated most of those opponents in battle, so we don't have to do that over again. Maybe that's a topic I'll cover in a future video, but the biggest takeaway just for this one is that we need Cross Guild versus Straw Hats because we need Mihawk versus Zoro at some point. It's kind of inevitable that these two crews are going to match up against each other specifically because those two need to fight each other. Even in a Davy back fight, there's a combat round at the end. So regardless of how things start shaking out in the final saga, I think Shanks versus Blackbeard is probably as inevitable as Mihawk versus Zoro. And if Shanks is really gonna fall by the hands of Blackbeard, then it might kind of make sense for Mihawk to fall near or at the very same time. Because we know that these two share a lot of deep connections with one another and had their own legendary duels back in the day. If they both fell at the same time, it would kind of mimic Big Mom and Kaido in some way, because they were allies back in the day on the Rocks crew, but both fell as Yonko on the very same night. Perhaps we can kind of get a similar feeling to that with Shanks and Mihawk, who are both kind of the strongest people on Yonko crews right now. Oda could even use that opportunity to show us their past because we can get both of their perspectives while they fight their respective opponents. What better way to show us their duels from their old rivalry while they're fighting their new rivals in real time? And if they both lose, they'd both be handing off the future to their proteges at the same time, because Shanks would be leaving the task of beating Blackbeard and bringing the Dawn to Luffy, which he's been kind of planning on for a really long time it seems like, while Mihawk hands over the title of World's Strongest Swordsman to Zoro. Since they have so much history, I just think it would be beautiful to have them fall in quick succession. And with Mihawk probably being the strongest member of the Cross Guild, if he were to lose, especially in a Davy back fight, the crew is basically over at that point, leaving us with just the Blackbeard pirates and Straw Hats left to duke it out for the One Piece. And lastly, I want to touch on Blackbeard's and Shanks' origins, because like I said at the beginning of the video, they each have mysterious connections to people at God Valley. Shanks with Fagarland Garling, who he seems to be related to, and then Blackbeard with Rox D. Zebek, who he seems to be inspired by at the very least, and even his ship is named Saber of Zebek. And if you think about it, Roger fought to protect the Celestial Dragons at God Valley, meaning he likely fought on the same side as Garling, and then conversely, Whitebeard worked under Rox back then. So Shanks and Blackbeard actually have two deep connections from each side of the God Valley confrontation, meaning they really do represent both sides of that conflict. And I have to imagine that when they finally have their 1v1 battle, some of those factors will come to light. Now, I'm not sure if Oda will tell us everything that there is to know about Blackbeard, because he's gotta save something in the tank for when he fights Luffy, or he does whatever he's gonna do with the government. But I do think that his connections to Rox make a lot of sense to be revealed here, as well as why he doesn't sleep. But as for Shanks, if this is really his end, I imagine this is where we find out probably everything. Whether he's Garling's son, why he was in the treasure chest, how he was allowed to walk into the Gorosei meeting room, what Roger whispered to him when they all disbanded, etc. And while there's a lot of juicy stuff there for us to uncover, I think the best part will actually be when Shanks Shanks tells Blackbeard about Luffy, about how he sacrificed his arm for Luffy, about how he gave Luffy his devil fruit that's obviously now related to Sun God Nika, how he thinks Luffy is probably the one to bring the dawn, and all of this stuff. Because if Blackbeard learns that Shanks has had his money on Luffy since literally day one, and Luffy has gone on to do all these crazy things over the years, that might kinda shake Blackbeard, especially if Blackbeard is familiar with some of the ancient history, like Joy Boy for example, which, you know, archaeology is one of Blackbeard's hobbies, so I definitely think he is aware of some of these elements. If Blackbeard hears all of this, he's probably gonna immediately connect some big dots and realize that Luffy is a bigger threat than he's been thinking up until this point, because really, Teach hasn't taken Luffy very seriously, because at first, he didn't even believe that Luffy would have a 30 million berry bounty in Jaya, and then the reason he wanted to pursue him in Water 7 was because he thought he'd be an easy 100 million berry target, and then when Luffy was named 5th Emperor by Morgans, Teach said that it was too early for him. He doesn't really put a lot of respect on Luffy's name, and I think that will ultimately be part of his downfall. Whitebeard told him to his face that his weakness was that he overestimates himself and gets careless, and that could definitely rear its head again when he fights Luffy in the end. Remember earlier I mentioned how Blackbeard acts like a coward by avoiding unnecessary fights versus strong people. He always tries to get an unfair or overwhelming advantage before he fights them, but he doesn't view Luffy as one of these strong people right now, and maybe that will cause him to start that fight underprepared, which could make whatever Shanks tells Blackbeard about Luffy so amazing. At first, I could see Blackbeard kinda laugh at Shanks, and maybe tell him how much of a fool he is for so obviously betting on the wrong horse. But then at the same time, I'm sure what he hears is gonna make Blackbeard feel a little strange deep down. Because I mean, fate or luck has been on Luffy's side so many times, and then if he finds out Shanks bet his arm on Luffy more than 10 years ago, maybe he will at least reevaluate his priorities. It may end up being a situation where Shanks loses the battle to Blackbeard, but he still wins the war because he's a big reason that Joy Boy is back, who will take care of business later on. Well, that's it for this video, guys. If you enjoyed it, please make sure to hit like and subscribe. It really helps the channel. And maybe check out this video that I just did where I discuss what each Straw Hat might do after finding the One Piece. But until next time, later.